In the heart of Wyoming's vast wilderness, where the wind carries secrets older than memory itself, a weathered rancher named Samuel Crawford lived alone on his family's ancestral land. For 23 years, he had worked these fields in solitude, haunted by the ghosts of a life that had once been full of laughter and love. His wife Sarah had passed in the harsh winter of 2001, and their only son Michael had died serving overseas 3 years later. The ranch that had once echoed with family gatherings now stood silent, except for the occasional lowing of cattle and the whistle of prairie wind through broken fence posts. Samuel had grown comfortable with his isolation, believing that solitude was his penance for surviving when those he loved had not. But fate, as it often does, had different plans waiting in the shadows of the Medicine Bow Mountains. On a particularly cold October morning in 2024, as frost painted the grass silver and his breath formed clouds in the crisp air, Samuel discovered something that would forever change his understanding of the world around him. Near the old creek that bordered his property, where his grandfather had once told him stories of the ancient peoples who had walked this land, he found a woman collapsed against a weathered cottonwood tree. She was clearly of Native American descent, her long black hair streaked with premature silver, her weathered face marked by what appeared to be severe illness. Her breathing was labored, her skin had an unhealthy pallor, and she wore traditional Apache clothing that seemed strangely well-preserved despite her obvious distress. Samuel's first instinct was to call for medical help, but something in her eyes, a depth of knowledge and an almost otherworldly presence made him pause. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, but her words carried the weight of centuries. She introduced herself as Ayana, which she explained meant eternal blossom in her native tongue, and she made a request that would have seemed absurd to most people. She asked not for a hospital or modern medical care, but for 30 days of shelter and care according to the old ways. She explained that she was dying of what doctors had told her was an untreatable condition, but she believed that the spirits had guided her to this specific place for a reason that would become clear in time. Samuel, despite his practical nature and 23 years of isolation, found himself agreeing to her unusual request. Perhaps it was the loneliness that had been eating at him like a slow poison, or perhaps it was something deeper, a recognition that this encounter was meant to happen. He helped her to the ranch house, settled her in his late wife's sewing room, and began what he assumed would be a brief but meaningful act of compassion for a dying stranger. The first week passed quietly, with Samuel providing basic care while Ayana seemed to exist in a state between sleep and wakefulness. She ate very little, spoke even less, but her presence began to change the atmosphere of the house in ways that Samuel couldn't quite articulate. The oppressive silence that had dominated his home for over 2 decades began to feel different, not empty, but expectant, as if the walls themselves were listening. During lucid moments, Ayana would share fragments of stories about her people, the Chiricahua Apache, and their deep connection to the land that stretched far beyond what most people could comprehend. She spoke of her grandmother, who had been a medicine woman of great renown, and of traditions that had been passed down through generations despite centuries of persecution and forced assimilation. Samuel found himself drawn to these stories, not just because they were fascinating, but because they awakened something in him that had been dormant since childhood, a sense of wonder about the mysteries that existed just beyond the edge of everyday understanding. As the second week began, strange things started happening around the ranch. Cattle that had been restless and difficult to manage suddenly became calm and seemed to graze in patterns that formed intricate designs when viewed from the hill behind the house. The old cottonwood tree where he had found Ayana began to bloom out of season, its branches suddenly heavy with leaves that should have fallen weeks earlier. Most unsettling of all, Samuel began to have dreams that felt more real than his waking life, dreams of this land as it had been centuries ago, populated by people who lived in harmony with forces that modern society had forgotten or dismissed as superstition. In these dreams, he saw his own ancestors, not the European settlers he had always been told about, but indigenous people who had called this place home for countless generations. When he mentioned these dreams to Ayana, she merely smiled and said that the land was beginning to remember him, just as he was beginning to remember the land. The third week brought revelations that shook Samuel to his core. While organizing his late father's papers, searching for medical records that might help him better care for Ayana, he discovered documents that had been hidden in a false bottom of an old desk. These papers told a story that contradicted everything he had believed about his family's history in Wyoming. According to these yellowed certificates and correspondence, his great-great-grandmother had not been a European immigrant as family stories claimed, but a Chiricahua Apache woman named Nazcha who had married a white settler in the 1880s. The documents revealed that she had hidden her heritage to protect her children from the discrimination and violence that Native Americans faced during that era. More shocking still, the papers indicated that she had been a keeper of sacred knowledge, responsible for protecting certain ancestral secrets that were considered too dangerous to share with outsiders. This discovery explained so much that had never made sense to Samuel: his grandfather's strange stories about the land, his father's inexplicable knowledge of weather patterns and animal behavior, and his own intuitive connection to the ranch that went far deeper than simple familiarity. But it also raised terrifying questions about why Ayanna had really come to his land and what she expected from him. When he confronted her with his discovery, her response was both illuminating and deeply unsettling. She revealed that she had not stumbled upon his ranch by accident, but had been guided there by visions that had begun months earlier. According to these visions, Samuel was the last direct descendant of Nazcha, and he possessed abilities that had been dormant but were now being awakened by her presence and the approaching completion of an ancient cycle that occurred only once every 150 years. Ayanna explained that his great-great-grandmother had been entrusted with protecting a sacred site located somewhere on his property, a place where the barrier between the physical and spiritual worlds was thinnest. This site contained what she called a memory stone, an ancient artifact that held the collected wisdom and experiences of her people going back over 1,000 years. But the stone was more than just a repository of knowledge. It was a living entity that required a guardian from Nazca's bloodline to maintain the balance between worlds. Without this guardian, the stone would begin to release its stored energy in dangerous and unpredictable ways, potentially causing catastrophes that would affect not just the local area, but the entire continental spiritual ecosystem. Nazcha had hidden the site's location and trained her descendants in secret, but the knowledge had been lost when Samuel's grandfather died in a hunting accident before he could pass on the final instructions to Samuel's father. The revelation that he was descended from Apache ancestors was overwhelming enough, but the idea that he had inherited mystical responsibilities seemed impossible to accept. Samuel had always been a practical man, someone who dealt with concrete realities like weather, crops, and livestock. The concept of spiritual guardianship and memory stones challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. But as Ayanna continued her explanation, events around the ranch began to support her seemingly impossible claims. The strange behavior of his cattle, the unseasonable blooming of trees, and his vivid dreams were all signs that the memory stone was becoming active, responding to his presence and his awakening heritage. More disturbing still, she warned him that others knew about the stone's existence and would soon come looking for it, drawn by the spiritual energy it was beginning to emit. During the 4th week of Ayanna's stay, these warnings proved prophetic when strangers began appearing around the edges of Samuel's property. At first, they seemed like ordinary people, a team of archaeologists claiming to be studying Native American historical sites, a group of geology students interested in the area's mineral formations, and various individuals who simply seemed to be passing through. But Samuel's newly awakened instincts told him that these visitors were not what they appeared to be. They asked too many specific questions about his family history, showed unusual interest in certain areas of his land, and possessed knowledge about local indigenous traditions that seemed far too detailed for casual researchers. Ayanna confirmed his suspicions, explaining that word of the stone's activation had spread through networks of people who sought to exploit such powerful artifacts for their own purposes. Some of these seekers were academics who wanted to study the stone and potentially remove it to a museum or research facility, never understanding that separating it from its sacred location would destroy its power and potentially cause ecological disasters. Others were collectors of occult artifacts who believed that possessing the stone would grant them supernatural abilities or immense wealth. Most dangerous of all were individuals who understood exactly what the stone was and sought to use its power for destructive purposes, knowing that corrupting its energy could give them influence over natural forces. Ayanna warned Samuel that as the stone's awakening progressed, it would attract increasingly dangerous attention, and he would need to master his inherited abilities quickly if he hoped to protect both the artifact and himself from those who would abuse its power. The process of awakening Samuel's dormant abilities proved to be both exhilarating and terrifying. Under Ayana's guidance, he began to experience the world in ways that defied scientific explanation. He found that he could sense the emotional states of his animals, predict weather changes days in advance, and most remarkably, communicate with what Ayana called the land spirits, ancient entities that existed as part of the landscape itself. These spirits had been trying to communicate with him for years through subtle signs and feelings, but his rational mind had dismissed their attempts as imagination or coincidence. Now, with his heritage awakened, he could hear their voices clearly, and what they told him was both wonderful and terrible. The spirits revealed that the memory stone was not just a repository of Apache wisdom, but a crucial component in a network of similar artifacts placed by indigenous peoples across North America centuries ago. These stones worked together to maintain spiritual and ecological balance across the continent, regulating everything from weather patterns to animal migration routes to the growth cycles of forests. The network had been severely damaged by centuries of colonization, industrialization, and the suppression of indigenous knowledge, but it had continued to function at a reduced capacity. Samuel's stone was one of the few remaining fully active nodes in this ancient network, making it incredibly valuable and equally dangerous in the wrong hands. As Samuel's abilities grew stronger, so did the pressure from those seeking to claim the stone. The casual visitors became more aggressive in their inquiries, and some began trespassing on his property during the night, using sophisticated equipment to search for electromagnetic anomalies or other signs that might lead them to the artifact's location. Samuel found himself having to use both conventional security measures and his newly developed spiritual senses to protect his land. The experience was exhausting and isolating, as he couldn't explain the situation to local law enforcement or anyone else without sounding insane. His only ally was Ayana, but her condition was deteriorating rapidly as they approached the end of the 30-day period she had requested. On the 28th day, Ayana's health took a dramatic turn for the worse. She could barely speak, and her breathing became so labored that Samuel feared she might not survive until morning. But when he suggested calling for medical help, she used her remaining strength to refuse, explaining that her death was necessary for the completion of the ritual that would fully awaken his guardianship of the stone. This revelation horrified Samuel, who had grown deeply attached to the wise woman who had become his first real companion in over 20 years. The idea that her death was somehow required felt like a betrayal of everything she had taught him about the sacred nature of life and the interconnectedness of all things. Through her labored breathing, Ayana explained the final truth about her mission and her relationship to him. She was not just a keeper of ancient knowledge, but the current guardian of the Memory Stone Network, a position that had been passed down through her family for generations. Her illness was not a disease in the conventional sense, but a spiritual condition brought on by the network's deteriorating condition and her own aging connection to the stones. She had been searching for Samuel not just to pass on knowledge, but to transfer her guardianship to him before her death severed her connection to the network permanently. This transfer could only happen during the window of spiritual energy that occurred when the barrier between worlds was thinnest, which would peak on the 30th day of her stay at his ranch. The 29th day was filled with final preparations and revelations that completed Samuel's understanding of his inheritance. Ayana led him to the location of the Memory Stone, which had been hidden beneath an innocuous-looking rock formation near the old creek where he had first found her. The stone itself was unlike anything Samuel could have imagined, not a carved artifact, but what appeared to be a naturally formed crystal that pulsed with its own inner light. When he touched it for the first time, he was overwhelmed by a flood of memories and knowledge that spanned centuries. He experienced the history of his land through the eyes of countless generations, felt the joy and sorrow of his ancestors, and understood the intricate relationships between all living things in ways that transformed his perception of reality forever. But with this knowledge came an understanding of the immense responsibility he was accepting. As guardian of the stone, he would need to remain on the land for the rest of his life, constantly monitoring the spiritual ecosystem and defending the artifact from those who would abuse its power. He would have access to wisdom and abilities that most humans could never imagine, but he would also bear the weight of knowing that his failure could result in ecological catastrophes affecting millions of people. The loneliness that had defined his adult life would continue, but now it would be tempered by a sense of purpose and connection to forces far greater than himself. On the morning of the 30th day, as the sun rose over the Medicine Bow Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ayanna passed away peacefully in the room that had once belonged to Samuel's wife. Her final words were a blessing in Apache that Samuel somehow understood despite never having heard the language before, a prayer for the land, for the continuation of the ancient wisdom, and for his success as the new guardian. As she died, Samuel felt a profound shift in his consciousness, as if a door that had been partially open was now thrown wide, connecting him permanently to the network of memory stones and the vast web of life they protected. The transformation was immediate and overwhelming. Samuel could suddenly sense the condition of ecosystems hundreds of miles away, feel the distress of polluted rivers and damaged forests, and understand the complex interplay of forces that maintained the planet's spiritual and ecological balance. But he could also sense hope. Other guardians scattered across the continent, some awakening to their heritage as he had, others who had been protecting their assigned sites for years in secret. He was not alone in this responsibility, and the network that had seemed so damaged was actually beginning to heal as more people reconnected with their indigenous heritage and accepted their roles as protectors of the sacred sites. With Ayanna's death, the immediate danger from those seeking the stone seemed to diminish, as if her passing had somehow concealed the artifact's location from those who would abuse it. Samuel buried her according to Apache traditions that he now understood intuitively, and found that his grief for her loss was mixed with gratitude for the gift she had given him. His life of isolation had ended, not through human companionship as he had once hoped, but through connection to something far greater, the living spirit of the land itself and his role as its protector. In the months that followed, Samuel's ranch became a sanctuary not just for him, but for others who carried indigenous heritage and were beginning to awaken to their own spiritual responsibilities. Some came as Ayanna had, guided by dreams and visions to seek his help in understanding their own connections to sacred sites. Others arrived as students, drawn by stories of the strange events at the isolated Wyoming ranch and hungry for knowledge that could help them reconnect with traditions their families had been forced to abandon generations earlier. Samuel found himself becoming a teacher and guide, roles he had never expected, but that felt as natural as breathing once he accepted them. The ranch that had once echoed with emptiness now buzzed with quiet activity as Samuel worked with visitors to understand their heritage, locate other sacred sites, and strengthen the network of guardians that protected the continent's spiritual ecosystem. The cattle that had once been his only companions were joined by wildlife that seemed drawn to the area's renewed spiritual energy, eagles that nested in impossible numbers, wolves that had not been seen in the region for decades, and plant species that began growing in combinations that created natural medicine gardens without any human cultivation. Samuel's story became a legend whispered among Native American communities across the country, the tale of an isolated rancher who discovered his true heritage and accepted the responsibility of guardianship that his bloodline had carried for generations. But more importantly, it became a symbol of hope for indigenous peoples who had been disconnected from their traditions, proving that the ancient knowledge could be recovered and that the sacred sites could be protected even in an increasingly modernized world. As Samuel stood on his porch each morning, watching the sun rise over land that he now understood in ways his ancestors had intended, he realized that his years of loneliness had not been punishment for surviving when his loved ones had not, but preparation for a purpose he could never have imagined. The isolation had taught him to listen to subtleties that others missed, to find contentment in simple things, and to develop the inner strength necessary to bear the responsibility of guardianship. Sarah and Michael's deaths, though still sources of grief, now seemed part of a larger pattern that had freed him to accept his true calling without the divided loyalties that might have made him hesitate. The memory stone continued to pulse beneath its hiding place, its light invisible to those who lacked the sight to perceive it, but blazing like a beacon to Samuel's awakened senses. Through it, he could feel the health of the network improving month by month as other guardians accepted their roles and began protecting their assigned sites. The work was far from complete. Centuries of damage could not be undone quickly, but the foundation for healing had been established, and the ancient wisdom was finding new voices to carry it forward into an uncertain future. Samuel Crawford had begun that October morning as a lonely rancher waiting for death on land that held only memories of loss. 30 days later, he had become something he could never have imagined. A bridge between worlds, a guardian of ancient wisdom, and a protector of forces that maintained the balance between the seen and unseen aspects of reality. The Fazendero Solitario had indeed discovered an ancestral secret, but more than that, he had discovered his true self and his place in a story far older and more important than he had ever dared to dream. The years that followed Samuel's transformation brought changes that rippled far beyond the boundaries of his Wyoming ranch. As word of his story spread through carefully guarded networks of indigenous communities, other descendants began emerging from lives of quiet assimilation, drawn by dreams and ancestral memories they had never understood. The ranch became an unofficial pilgrimage site, though Samuel was careful to maintain the appearance of an ordinary cattle operation to avoid unwanted attention from those who might seek to exploit or commercialize the sacred site. By 2027, 3 years after Ayana's death, Samuel had helped awaken 17 other guardians across North America. Each discovery followed a similar pattern: individuals living ordinary lives suddenly experiencing vivid dreams, unexplained connections to specific landscapes, or encounters with wildlife that seemed almost supernatural in their intelligence and purposefulness. A Lakota construction worker in South Dakota began having visions of the Black Hills that led him to a hidden cave containing another memory stone. A woman of mixed Cherokee and Irish heritage living in suburban Atlanta found herself compulsively driving to remote areas of the Appalachian Mountains, where she discovered her role as guardian of an ancient grove that had been protecting the southeastern water table for centuries. The network's restoration brought tangible benefits that scientists struggled to explain. Drought-stricken areas began receiving more regular rainfall, polluted rivers started cleaning themselves at rates that defied environmental models, and wildlife populations began recovering in regions where they had been declining for decades. Samuel knew these changes were the result of the memory stones working together to rebalance natural systems that had been disrupted by centuries of industrial development, but he was careful never to make such claims publicly. The Guardians had learned from their ancestors' experiences that open discussion of their responsibilities only invited persecution and interference from those who feared what they could not understand. The most profound change, however, was in Samuel himself. The lonely, grief-stricken man who had found Ayana dying beneath the cottonwood tree had been replaced by someone who carried himself with quiet confidence and spoke with the measured wisdom of someone connected to forces far greater than individual ambition or desire. His neighbors noticed the change, commenting that Samuel Crawford seemed to have found peace with his solitary life in ways that surprised those who had watched him struggle with isolation for so many years. What they could not see was that his solitude was no longer empty, filled now with constant awareness of the living landscape around him and his connection to guardians scattered across the continent. On quiet evenings, Samuel would sit on his porch and extend his consciousness through the Memory Stone network, checking on the health of ecosystems thousands of miles away, offering guidance to newly awakened guardians, and sometimes simply marveling at the complexity and beauty of the spiritual web that indigenous peoples had maintained for millennia before European colonization nearly destroyed it. These moments brought him a satisfaction deeper than anything he had experienced in his previous life, a sense of participating in something sacred and eternal that transcended individual mortality. The stone beneath his land continued to pulse with increasing strength, its energy now synchronized with 16 other active nodes and dozens more that were beginning to stir as their guardians awakened to their heritage. Samuel could feel the network approaching a critical threshold, a point where it would become self-sustaining and capable of expanding without direct human intervention. When that moment arrived, probably within the next decade, the guardians would shift from emergency restoration work to long-term maintenance, ensuring that the wisdom of their ancestors continued to protect the continent's spiritual and ecological balance for generations yet unborn. As Samuel reflected on the strange journey that had brought him from lonely rancher to spiritual guardian, he understood that Ayana's 30-day stay had been both an ending and a beginning. It marked the end of his disconnection from his true heritage and the beginning of his participation in an ancient tradition that had survived centuries of suppression and cultural genocide. Her death had not been a tragedy, but a transformation, her spirit joining the collective consciousness stored in the memory stones, while her knowledge and responsibilities passed to him as they had been designed to do by ancestors whose wisdom extended far beyond the limitations of individual lifetimes. The story of the fazendero solitario who discovered his ancestral secret had become a legend, but more importantly, it had become a beacon of hope for indigenous communities across North America. Samuel's transformation proved that the old knowledge could be recovered, that sacred sites could be protected, and that the spiritual network their ancestors had created could be restored even in an age of skepticism and technological dominance. His ranch stood as proof that indigenous wisdom was not a relic of the past, but a living tradition capable of adapting to modern challenges while maintaining its essential connection to the sacred patterns that governed the natural world. In accepting his role as guardian, Samuel had found not just purpose, but a form of immortality that his ancestors had always understood, the continuation of essential work that transcended individual existence. The memory stone would outlive him by millennia, and when his time came, he would train his successor just as Ayana had trained him, ensuring that the ancient compact between his bloodline and the land would continue until the earth itself no longer needed protection. The lonely rancher had become part of something eternal, and in that transformation, he had found the peace and meaning that had eluded him throughout his years of isolation and grief.